Have you ever dreamed of leaving home to live somewhere totally different? Maybe somewhere with a slower pace, a rich food culture, and daily trips to the market? That's exactly what Jeff Koehler did. He left Washington State more than 25 years ago, heading to London for graduate work. But ultimately, love brought him to Barcelona, and he's since made his home and his career there, splitting his time between the mainland and the Balearic Islands off the coast of Spain. I really love this stuff, the culinary culture of a place that I know little about. And if you do too, stick around. This is Chris Spear, and you're listening to Chefs Without Restaurants, the show where I speak with culinary entrepreneurs and people working in the food and beverage industry outside of a traditional restaurant setting. I have 32 years of working in kitchens, but not restaurants, and currently run a personal chef service called Perfect Little Bites, doing dinner parties in the Washington, D.C. area. So Jeff is a food writer, traveler, and author. His new book, The Spanish Mediterranean Islands Cookbook, is out now. Jeff's published 9 books, including the North African Cookbook, Where the Wild Coffee Grows, and Morocco, A Culinary Journey with Recipes. His works appeared in places like NPR and the Washington Post, and he's won the IACP Award for Literary Food Writing. All this to say that Jeff lives and breathes food and likes to write about it. And again, I found this really interesting because I didn't know anything about the islands off the coast of Spain. I mean, I'd heard of Ibiza as a place that people would go to party, but from a culinary standpoint, I didn't know anything about these 4 islands. In fact, now he has me thinking that I might even take my family vacation there next year. So we talk about Jeff's journey from Seattle to Menorca, the vibrant food culture of Spain's islands, and how you, yes, even without a Mediterranean market nearby, can bring a taste of these islands into your own kitchen. And if you're enjoying this show, I'd love for you to check out another podcast I produce called Personal Chef Business Startup Guide. Whether you're just getting started or looking to take your personal chef business to the next level, I think it's full of actionable tips, real-world advice, and the stuff that I wish I knew when I was first starting out. As always, thanks so much for listening, and have a great week. Hey, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks.
I'm looking forward to talking to you. You've got a new book coming out. It looks phenomenal. And I was just saying to you, it's something that I know nothing about, which is why I wanted to have you on the show. So you grew up in the Pacific Northwest, is that right? Washington?
I did. I grew up just north of Seattle and went to Gonzaga. And then I left the States in 1991. Went up to go for a year traveling in Africa, and 1 year became 4. And then I ended up doing my graduate work in London. And in London, I met a woman from Barcelona, and I followed her back home and stayed. And we got married not too long afterwards, and I'd been living in Spain since 1996.
That sounds pretty fun. And, you know, especially right about now, obviously, I'm in the US and there is a lot of weird stuff and a lot of people talking about, like, maybe I don't want to live here anymore. And, maybe 25 years ago would have been a good time for me to find someplace really exciting to live. Not that I'm anti-American, if anyone's listening or whatever, but, you know.
It is a great place, and I had never been here before when I first went. I just happened to end up in a absolutely phenomenal place. So it was quite lucky because I probably would have followed her anywhere, you know. So I just happened to be Barcelona, which certainly cannot complain to that.
What do you love so much about Spain for people who've maybe never been there? And I guess that's an oversimplification because Spain is a huge country and there's so many different areas. And like I said, I've been to Madrid. I know Barcelona is very different, but like what is about the country in particular that you loved and made you want to stay there?
Well, I mean, food-wise, because there's so much culture that I just love. The Mediterranean culture really was. I mean, growing up in the Pacific Northwest, you know, it was a big change living in the Mediterranean. Certainly, the light was the first winter here was particularly memorable. You know, January, February, March, every day pulling up the blinds and it's blue sky and it's sunny. That was amazing. But I just kind of focus on the food part. I mean, that for me was a real revelation, especially the sense of how tied the food was to the seasons and to all of the holidays. You know, every holiday, you know, has very specific dishes. And I grew up, we had a couple, you know, of course, you got Thanksgiving dinner, and there's some very specific things that we ate in our house growing up. But here it seemed to be just a lot of, everything has a reason for it. I guess I put it this way. There was these great traditions of food based on times of the year. And it really often has a very practical reason, why you're eating that particular item that time of year. It's traditional for that holiday or that weekend, but there's often a link to that, to the season, to what's kind of growing. And so for me, it was a big education in really learning, seasonal produce. I grew up working in Safeway in a supermarket, and I was all year round a lot of things, and I didn't really have the sense of that you couldn't get some products outside of a certain time of year. And certainly the other thing was seeing, like, for instance, my mother-in-law's refrigerator, which is relatively empty because she would go to the market every day. And so there was just a handful of things, and then the daily fresh shopping. And that was a big change coming from, Pacific Northwest, the extra freezer in the garage, and then this kind of settler mentality where we had, where I grew up quite rurally, so we had chickens and we had animals. So we had a lot of things. And suddenly living in Barcelona was different, going shopping every day, but not one store. It was the produce store, it was the butcher, it was the fish store, it was, I have 5 fruit stores within a block or two of my apartment. So there's no reason to buy more than you need because you're going to walk by that fruit store 5 times by tomorrow. So you just buy a little time. And that was a shift. So you really change a little bit how you think and how you plan for your meals, in a sense of you plan less. And this became highlighted when I started going to Menorca. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, but when we settled in Menorca is an extreme version of that. And so my cooking shifted even further in being very, very focused on what you can find in the market today. And you will go to the fish market with an idea what you want to make, but never with a set recipe because you don't know what it's going to be in the fish market, what you're going to find.
But I think that's like there has to be a huge cultural shift because, here it's like I get up in the morning, I take my kids to school, and then it's like I got to walk my dog, and then I've got a job, and you're there for like 8 or 9 hours, and you come home and you take your kids to their sports games and you do your thing. Like the idea of shopping every day is daunting to me. I think it's just like we have a busier pace of life. I don't want to go. It sounds great in a sense, but like I don't want to go shopping every day if it's to a regular grocery store. I want to go and get it done on Sunday and not have to go back till Thursday. So the idea that like every day you're just going to amble along and go to 3 or 4 markets sounds nice in the romantic sense, but like what about people who work normal, like say 9 to 5 jobs? I don't know that would work here.
Yeah, it's different because obviously we do a lot of shopping on Saturday mornings and stuff, but it's very different when you go into a small fruit store that's selling fruit and vegetables and a few things. You kind of pop into a few things that pop out. It's not go in with your big cart and do the whole week thing. I see your point, and yeah, obviously my lifestyle's a little bit more flexible, but things are open later here also. So people tend to, on their way home from work or in the morning when you walk your dog, often we walk my dog in the morning, I often walk her to the meat store. You just kind of clip her outside, you go in and you get your couple of things, get your meat for that day, and then walk her back. So often it's right next to there's a fruit store next to it and there's a bakery right next to it. So you can do your 3 main things in your very short morning walk with the dog.
Well, that sounds amazing.
So that's a real advantage. We live in the quite central in the city. In Menorca, where the house is a little different because it's in the middle of a village. And then it's even easier, but more difficult because things take longer because you speak a lot more to people on the street. So for instance, I'll go to Menorca just in another week or two, and within a day, I will have spoken on the street more than a month in Barcelona, probably. In a sense that the bakery is just 1 minute away. But it's guaranteed you're going to pass a couple of people haven't seen. You stop, you chat, so you gotta be prepared for that. But I love that. Growing up in a very small place north of Seattle, I like the small town life. So for me, it was actually it's a nice balance between being in the city of in center of Barcelona and being kind of the village life, to kind of combining them both.
So I guess we kind of skipped over it because I don't even know how much people know about the geography, but there's a cluster of islands off of the coast of mainland Spain. So when you talk about go into Menorca, that's an island, and that's one of, 4 islands? Is that correct?
Exactly. So you have the Balearic Islands. It's a group of 4 that are not far off the Mediterranean coast off the east coast of Spain. Now, it's a 30-minute flight or whatever, but it's close, but they're quite distinct and they're quite connected. And this is what makes them interesting, I think, is that you have these 4 islands that have their own traditions, their own linguistic dialects or version of Catalan, their own cooking traditions, separate from the mainland Spain, although there is some influences and there's some overlap. It's not 100% different, but they're certainly quite unique. And even within the islands, there's some distinction between them. Okay, so you have Mallorca is the biggest one. And this is about the size of Rhode Island, maybe. And this is kind of the center of the 4. And it's got about 1 million people. It's a big island, a big mountain range that runs across the north. And then to the north of that is Menorca, which is smaller. So this Menorca is about, I want to say 25 miles by 10 miles, kind of bean-shaped. About 100,000 people. And then Ibiza is to the south of Mallorca. And Ibiza is about the same size. And next to Ibiza, almost connected, is a very small one called Formentera. So these are the 4. And, the weather is quite different. The geography is quite different. And the reason that they're different from one to the other really is, culinary speaking, is these islands are relatively isolated until surprisingly late. These are in the Mediterranean. They're part of the Mediterranean pathways. The Phoenicians were there and the Romans, and there's a lot of this. But still, they're quite isolated. And so they developed kind of on their own out of necessity. And that means that these islands developed their culinary traditions with the food that could be caught or grown or foraged or captured or found. And so there's quite a close connection of the food to the land itself, much more than elsewhere, because, again, you're an island, so you're automatically isolated. If you think that in Mallorca was, 19th century until there was regular ferry service. Ibiza, I don't think, had regular boat service to the mainland until the 1930s. Of course, now with the population has summer swelled to 1 million and it's very global and stuff, but if you think back, until tourism, salt was Ibiza's main source of revenue. And the salt was these big salt pans were planted by the Phoenicians. And for thousands of years, salt was the main source of revenue for the island. This is it's hard to kind of sometimes remember when you go to Ibiza and with the discos and all the famous jet set, just how distinct and different and isolated the island really was.
How did that get that reputation? Because, I only know you hear about it as like this party place that people go, and it's so close, yet it seems so culturally different than the other 3 islands. So how did that island become that kind of party place?
Well, one, it has the best weather because it's protected. It sits kind of southwest of the other, so it's quite protected from the northern Tramontana winds. A bit lower, a bit more southern. So, for instance, compared to Menorca, it has, it's much nicer weather for more months. It was closer to start with. It isn't really so far up there that. And in the 50s, you started getting these famous Hollywood people going, Truman Capote. I don't know, kind of famous Hollywood actors are going and kind of started this, and it just kind of grew from there. And now it continues to certainly be, one of the arguably the most famous summer spot in all of Europe, And it's amazing because you go off season. I tend to go off season to Ibiza, and everything is, so many things are closed. It's just beautiful and sunny. And you go in the springtime and there's a lot of almond trees on the island. Almond trees are blooming, and it's just beautiful. And it's pink and the white flowers. And just half the things are closed, and there's like nobody around, and you're on the beach on alone. And then you go in August. You can't believe that it's the same place.
It's not quite the same, but like I grew up in Massachusetts and I still have family on Cape Cod, and it's the same thing. Like my dad hated going during the the high season because like the traffic and the tourists, and it was like crazy expensive. So we would only go in like the fall and the winter. But again, you go and it's like there's one restaurant in town that's open and everyone has left the island, except for the people who live there. But it's like just the local pizza shop because the tourism is so, they're only there to go to the beaches and that kind of summer stuff. So it's nice to get a break from that, but also there's not as much to do.
Yeah. The only thing that I would say about Ibiza that I think was a surprise to me the first time I went. Again, so maybe I back up slightly to explain it because I started going to Menorca. The first time was back in maybe 1999. And then we started going for the summer in 2010. By then we were going for the summer with our kids. And then we bought a house a couple of years later. So I knew Menorca very well before I started traveling to the other islands. So that was a prism that I saw. And so I had that same kind of viewpoint as I always thought, well, I mean, Ibiza, it must be crazy full. But actually the island, if you get away from a few of the main kind of urban areas, the island is surprisingly rural. And the whole north of Ibiza is just stunning, full of pine trees. And, I think that we tend to hear about Ibiza and, Pacha and clubs. And it's, especially here in Europe, and it's legendary. That even in the August when you go, you can still find a surprising amount of green space, So Menorca is one of the most rural ones. And part of that has to do with the fact that it has the worst weather, which is all relative because compared to most places, it's got great weather. And it was the last to kind of develop, and it's much more rural and surprisingly rural, actually. You have a city on each end, the Maon on one end and today on the other, and then you have kind of this road that runs across the center. And then you have these almost like fish bones, and you have the side roads running to the coast. So they're not like a road that just encircles the whole coastline. Full of beaches, many up to walk to. And our house is in the very center of the island, in a market city, but literally the center of the island. So what I love in Menorca is that kind of ruralness, and it's just gorgeous. So exploring the other islands, even if they're bigger, I'm still quite captured by how rural they all are. You tend to think about parts of Mallorcan coast parts of the coast packed. I mean, it's just built up. But the whole center of the island, and of course, Mallorca has this incredible mountain range. I mean, a mountain is a phenomenal mountain range that you can really get out and it still follows quite ancient traditions.
Now, is it reasonable to bounce from one to another? Like if you went there for vacation, how easy is it to go from island to island? Is that a ferry thing? Do you have to take little hopper planes? How does that work?
Sometimes it can be easier to fly, but for instance, the west coast of Menorca, so Tutereya, it's an hour fast ferry to the east coast of Mallorca. I mean, you can see it. It's there. That's only an hour. That's pretty easy. Realistically, it can be easier to fly between some of the islands. Depends where you are, what part. I always take the ferry. It's a night ferry. You can get a fast ferry that I think is 3.5 or 4 hours. But I always usually go by the night ferry. I love it. It leaves like 11 p.m. and you just kind of slip away and you pull into the Port of Maon at dawn. It's just a magical way to travel. And it's kind of the easiest. Growing up in Washington, we took lots of ferries, but they were very short, ferries. I've always had a great love for traveling on the sea, for ferries.
Well, you wrote a cookbook about these islands that you love so much. How did that come about? And previously, how many books have you written at this point? Because this is not your first rodeo.
No, this is the ninth book that's being published. Most of those are cookbooks, a couple of narrative nonfiction books in there. And it's kind of interesting because Menorca and the islands is something I never really wanted to write about too much. But then suddenly that's all I wanted to write about. And part of it came from this thing I was explaining earlier, that the more I traveled around the island, all four of them, the more fascinated I became in those similarities and those differences. That's when I really wanted to do a book about the islands and looking at those links. Because it was an interesting combination, I think, from my life in Menorca, kind of, in the middle of our town is literally the place of the market. There was a market that was established in our town in about 1301.
That's a long time ago.
It was a king who was ruling out at the time gave it the official permission to be a market town. So my town was newly established. It is literally a market town, and it has this Thursday market most of the year in the morning, and then in the summer in the afternoons. And it's the most famous market in the whole island. And so I literally live in the middle of the island's marketplace. And so there's that element of, being, say, 4 months a year or more in this place. And then the other islands. And so over the years, as I've, spent more and more time there, as I said, I became extremely fascinated looking at, Ibiza's difference with Menorca. Part of it is geography and landscape, or terroir, I guess you'd call it, the weather, some other traditions. In Menorca, for instance, we had English ruled the island for the 18th century. So there's a couple of English traditions that came in that you don't really find elsewhere. The tradition of gin, for instance, they started producing gin for the sailors because it's considered Mahon, the capital of the island, is considered the finest port basically in the Mediterranean. And so the British Navy was there for a century. And so they started making gin for them, the sailors. And then when they sailed away, they just continued making it. But it's a very different gin. It's a wine-based gin. Very, very, very popular. I mean, it's absolutely fundamental to island life. It's in all the fiestas. And so you get some interesting traditions like that are really specific to the island. And so it was trying to capture in a book kind of that what makes each place special, but also what makes the islands together special.
And it sounds like that's maybe your favorite of the 4 islands as far as cuisine goes. Is that fair to say, the one that you chose to live on?
Yeah, I'm going to say yes. Although, for instance, Mallorca, which is much bigger, and Mallorca truly is, you can't imagine a place more fertile than parts of Mallorca. It's truly amazing. And then you go to Formentera, and you can't imagine a place less fertile. So Formentera is only like 10 or 12 miles long, and in some places just a mile wide, kind of Z-shaped. And not much is grown there, but what they do have is just phenomenal. So I'd love to go to Formentera because I know you're going to get the most amazing figs. And if the figs are in season, you can't believe it. But outside of that, they dry them. And they have this great tradition of they open them up and they dry them in the sun, and they pack them in these kind of ceramic pots layered with bay leaves and with anise and spices. And then they open them up like at Christmas time. And you eat these for dessert with, say, almonds. Absolutely stunning. And because the idea of the pantry is fundamental to these islands, but specifically in the places that you had to be quite self-sufficient. So things like these dried figs are absolutely fundamental to the diet of Formentera, along with the goat and with sheep cheese and various versions of that. And then dried fish. So they have a thing there called pêche sec, which literally means dried fish. And this is a classic Formentera thing where you take usually like a type of ray or maybe like a sand shark. They salt them and they dry them like you would kind of a ham and elsewhere in Spain.
So is it like a salt cod kind of thing?
Kind of, but then they cut them up into small pieces and then they store them in olive oil. And then you take it out of the olive oil and then they tend to eat it on salads. So it's kind of a combination between anchovy and tuna flavor. And it's kind of stringy because of these kind of long pieces. So they're put in these jars and you cut them up and then you kind of pull it out. And so you can have them with just tomatoes on a salad. But the classic salad is a bit more elaborate, maybe some roasted peppers, some potatoes, some kind of these giant kind of croutony type of bread things. Again, the bread that is like double baked to kind of be able to cure. And it's almost like an ancient version of bread. And they kind of toss it with some olive oil, maybe some vinegar, and with some of this shredded fish on top. These kind of things, like many, many dishes, are based on necessity. How can we make or preserve enough things to survive the year? The whole tradition of the butchering of the pig, specifically in Menorca, is absolutely fundamental to the cuisine because that you preserve pork. Your sobrasada, which is like a kind of a spreadable pork sausage, these kind of things, you preserve them. And this is what you ate during the year when you didn't have that fresh pork. And it's just key. And it's everywhere in the cuisine. So you get in Formentera, this version from the sea, where because there were really very, very few pigs, if any, growing, and certainly no cows. Where in Mallorca, you have, and Menorca, and also Ibiza, you have sobrasada, which is the fundamental flavor of the islands. One of the defining characteristics of the cuisine of these islands is this spreadable pork sausage. Chorizo from Spain is quite firm. This is quite spreadable.
Is it like andouilla? Do you know the andouilla sausage? That's like the spicy Calabrian chilies in there, and that's a spreadable fermented?
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar. This is not spicy. So this has a lot of paprika, but it's a sweet paprika and other spices and all kinds of different shapes. And they use it in just about everything. And I'm talking literally anything. And I'm talking even pastries. So one of the great pastries in the islands is the ensaimada, which is this coiled pastry made with kind of fermented dough. And you can get it with sobrasada kind of on top of it. I mean, you get baked apples, sobrasada inside. And it's mixed into meatballs. It's stuffed into squid. It's, spread on bread with honey put in the oven. I mean, it's 50 ways. And that was a challenge in this book, not to have 3/4 of the recipes calling for sobrasada, because you almost could, because it was a way, the joke about baking gives everything flavor. You often hear in the States. Well, this is this is like that, but this is a very interesting sausage, and it's very common. And even when we bought our house in the attic, we have a classic 19th century kind of 3-story village townhouse, and the top floor is this big attic. And there was just hundreds of nails, these kind of hooks in the beams, because the family, they butchered their pig every year, and they prepared the family sobrasada, and they hung them in the attic, and they added, a little bit of this to the soup, to the rice, to the dishes throughout the year, to give it a little bit of flavor, to give it some fat, to give it color, because it's quite beautiful orange, because it's a protein. And it's just shocking how frequent it can be in traditional cooking and how good it is. I mean, it's just phenomenally tasty.
Now, is there a culture of other cured, like charcuterie, like a jamon or something like a firmer, like a chorizo type sausage? Do you see that there as well?
For sure. I mean, a lot of it goes into the sobrasada, but there's a whole host of blood sausages. They're all different kind of names, but these kind of chopped, some cured, some not, some are boiled. Certainly, a lot of these go back to it was Rome, and the Romans had, the Romans were there. A lot of these started back in the days of the Romans. Because a lot of the traditions began, with the Phoenicians, the Romans, and then it was controlled by the Moors, or the Muslim coming from Spain that ruled for, say, 300 years. And then, especially, you get these layers of culture that were kind of changing or kind of highlighting some of the developing more. Maybe olives were introduced by the Phoenicians, the Romans, a bit more planting, and then when the Moors came in, or the Arabs, they, perfected olive oil production, for instance, some of the planting. So you see this kind of throughout, and this charcuterie tradition certainly dates way back and is absolutely fundamental. And that's why it's interesting to see, for instance, this dried fish in Formentera. And then, of course, you have the cheese tradition. Menorca has one of the oldest, because Menorca is really the only island that has a tradition of cows. And so you get, along with the sheep cheese and the goat cheese, you have a lot of cow cheese with that. And that's something that you find in the market. So the weekly market, any of the weekly markets, but in ours, for instance, you see lots of the producers come down and they sell it themselves.
Now, how much exchange of products is there within the islands? I mean, obviously, they're somewhat isolated, but, with modern transportation, it seems like it would be easier now than it was. Do you see a lot of, the figs going from one island to another, or the cow cheese going to one of the other islands? Or are they still kind of keeping 4 very distinct cuisines using just products on their own islands?
Things like cheeses, you can certainly get, but the Menorca has such a great tradition of cheese that, it's one of the denomination of origin cheeses. So you can get the Menorcan cheese all around Spain. we tend to shop quite local. I mean, we kind of know the person who's making the cheese, and so you're getting that fresh cheese that she made the day before. She comes on, but it's like that because it's kind of small town kind of throughout. So you know that the neighbor across the street is the aunt of the cheese lady that we like who sells in the market. And so, you just know everybody and you just know when it comes down and she's also doing something on the side and other things. So we like her cheese in particular, but at the market, there's probably 6 or 8 local producers selling their own particular cheese and often them themselves. And what I really love is to be able to see how that same product changes throughout the year. So her cheese is not the same all year round because, of course, what they eat is different in the winter. The island is very green. In the winter, it's quite dry in the summer. So the milk is different percentages of fat. So there are nuances of differences in her products. And that's one of the pleasures of buying from the same producer throughout the year is kind of seeing that change. That kind of makes sense.
It does. And again, that's something that I feel like we've lost a little bit here in the States. Like, again, you go to the store and you buy this stuff and you don't really know where it comes from. And I don't think people even necessarily like variety. I think we get accustomed to things being the way they are. And if you went and you got a cheese today and it tasted differently than that same cheese was 6 months ago, I don't know that everyone would even like that.
You have, 2 main kinds of cows on the island. The traditional native breed, which is kind of they call them literally a red cow because it's kind of a tannish color in the sun. It looks kind of reddish brown. And then you have the black and white cows that were introduced, I think, by the English. And then, so these tend to produce more milk, but it's a different milk than the native cows produce. So native cows like a higher fat percentage, for instance, and they tend to be more agile. So they tend to kind of climb the slopes more, where the other ones are a little bit more the farm. And so it's become more popular to kind of bring these back. Like I know what kind of cow is actually producing our cheese, which is rare, and that's a treat. And it's not being, overly presenting it. You just kind of know that because that's, she produces less cheese, but it's a different kind of milk and it's a little bit richer in that. And that's one of the pleasures for me of that kind of islandy, villagey lives that I totally fell in love with, because it's great pleasure in knowing that. Because like you said, so many things that we buy and eat, we don't know where they come from. It's impossible. And some people take it obviously much further than that. And maybe part of that is because when I was growing up, we had chickens, we had eggs, and so butcher them. We had for many years, we'd raise a cow. We had a couple of pigs. You kind of knew where the eggs came from. And for me, going back after, some years to getting a little bit of sense of that felt quite natural. And certainly it's different, as when you have to tell her in advance, or the eggs, for instance, that's already fast. So if you have to go to her meat store, you tell her, save me a dozen eggs. And as the eggs from these kind of farms are very different than the ones you're going to buy, even in the fridge store. Just, and so you take your own little, egg carton, or else they put them in a piece of newspaper and they kind of coil them up. And market day, for instance, I always know what we're going to have usually to eat. Like we eat kind of the same thing because it's the same. It's going to be based on what you buy. So maybe in the spring. So when I go here in a couple of weeks, the wild asparagus will be out, and so if we're lucky, you can gather up some wild asparagus, and if you're particularly lucky, they'll be selling some in the market.
So you've written a cookbook that is, representing a cuisine that's very of time and place and seasonal and special. So how does that translate to someone like, say, me who picked up this book? It's great reading, but am I going to be able to have some success creating some of these recipes? I mean, I'm sure there's going to have to be some modifications based on what I can find, but do you find that this is a book that people who don't live in your area will still be able to do some of these recipes?
Oh, absolutely. All of them. I mean, these are not obscure. These are one popular recipes. Again, at home, we eat my work. I can say, just these are things that we eat over and over again at home that my kids love, that my kids eat and ask for or don't ask for, things that I make for people that come over. And Obviously I have lots of ideas for substitutions, but I wanted to include sopa de asada because you can get a lot of these ingredients now. And so, you know, in my first cookbook, say 5 years ago, is very different because you couldn't get lots of these things. So you were much more aware of what you use as main ingredients. But now I said, well, you actually can, if you order online, lots of those things. So I wanted to have the authentic. I mean, you want somebody who's in the island to be able to open the book, recognize it, make it, and say, yeah, that's exactly like I remember growing up, as well as you being able to make it at home and saying, this is what it is. So it's trying to capture kind of both of that. I mean, absolutely, I think you can get a great sense of the islands. And the first thing you're going to see is how Mediterranean it is. This is one of the world's purest Mediterranean diets. So apart from 1 century of English in Menorca, there's really not any other influences coming outside. I mean, of course, you have the products like tomatoes and those things, in the Great Columbian Exchange, but it's very, very Mediterranean. It's a very Mediterranean diet with the fish and the pulses and the vegetables, and it's just Mediterranean, and I kept it very traditional, nothing, as I said, you can find a lot of modern things, obviously now, avocado toast is inescapable
Mhm.
in restaurants, but those I see are additions to the local food as opposed to substitutions. That makes sense. People still love, my
Yeah.
Menorcan friends and my Ibiza friends, they can imagine food that's better. My wife was from some Catalan, and she can't imagine the cuisine that's better. And I still find that true here. That people on the islands, they love their food and they're enormously proud of it. And you go to the house. I mean, this is what we eat. You know, and I think that you won't have any problems filling your weekly menu with interesting seasonal ingredients.
But, we are in the age where chefs and food writers all over the world are writing books. And I think we're buying them and looking at them. And your publisher that this book is with is great, but they are also known for releasing books that I think are from some of the most obscure restaurants in the world. I have the Noma cookbook. I don't have access to ants. I have the Favakin book. I can't get reindeer. I have the DOM cookbook. I have none of the Amazonian fish. It's just one of these things chefs do is they buy these books of these great restaurants and places. And then it's like, I don't have access to 400 types of Peruvian potatoes, So it's something that you read from a educational, historical sense, but not necessarily something where you're going to break the book out and make the dinner for your friends and family.
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't want to do that. And my last book is for Fido and also the North African Cookbook, which is a little bit the same, different approach, but same idea of looking at a region, almost 450 some recipes, but the same idea that I didn't want to make it too obscure, it's important that people can both recognize it that live there, but also be able to make it at home, because the point is that you can make these recipes. And so, yeah, I think that because I don't have a 3-star, restaurant with 2 Michelin stars. I have, an extremely small kitchen. I mean, you can almost touch off for a wall with your arms. I mean, certainly 2 of them, but very small kitchen, 2 girls and a wife that have grown up eating my work, and it's what I can get here. And when I'm home with, and my mom's in Seattle, for me, it's very important that you can make these and they're going to come out like you're going to find here, that they're still authentic enough. They're doable, but they're authentic. I mean, there is a recipe for the wild asparagus. We're making a tortilla. You can do it with normal asparagus, and we do it, but it's such a wonderful spring treat because eggs are the one thing that truly absorb the flavors of the season. And eggs are enormously, enormously important here in Spain and in the islands, for every meal except for breakfast, at lunch, dinner, snack, your tortilla, your kind of scrambled version, bringing in the savory ingredients, bringing in seafood, they're enormously complex. Eggs are one of the staples, and you can do all kinds of great things with them. I don't know how many.
Well,
You
we
know,
can't
one of
we can't talk about that right now because eggs are pushing $9 a dozen here in the U.S. right now. It's we're looking at all the food writers are writing articles about how to replace eggs in all of your recipes and what are restaurants doing to take egg dishes off the menu.
The thing with the eggs is that you can create a whole meal with just 2 eggs or 3, because you're sauteing, some maybe asparagus, and if you want to put some shrimp in there or some garlic, or you're making a base, and then you stir in a couple of whisked eggs and you let them kind of sit for a couple of seconds, and then you give them a couple of very gentle kind of sweeps of the pan, and you give her what they call in Spanish revuelto, which is not like scrambling it out, but the eggs then are taking all those flavors of the pan. So we do this all the time with mushrooms or with whatever kind of vegetables. You're kind of using that egg as kind of a binder, but it completely soaks up all the flavors. A little bit different than the classic, Spanish egg and onion tortilla, which is also popular. And in the book, I have one I think interesting one that you'll find there sometimes, which we love, is with sobrasada and fresh mint leaves. And it's very simple. And it's just you make what here they call like a French tortilla. You just kind of fold it over like a couple of times. You don't have to make a fancy tortilla. But you get that sobrasada and then that mint, and the combination of flavors is surprising.
So, what are your favorite recipes from this book for someone who maybe picks it up and haven't made anything? Where's a good starting point for people? Do you have a few things you like?
Yeah. If you can get fresh sardines, sometimes that'd be easiest. Now I know some place on the East Coast and the West Coast. Sardines are one of the great summer treats for us. You can grill them, whatever. But we really love escabeche, which is this kind of marinade, this olive oil and vinegar kind of marinade. It's very typical across Spain, the islands also, but with the sardines, it's probably the easiest. You just kind of, once they're clean, you just kind of can fry the sardines for a moment, and you kind of lay them in a dish. And then you make this kind of olive oil marinade, olive oil, vinegar, some spices, onions and stuff. And then you kind of pour that hot marinade over the fish, and then you let them sit for a couple of days before you kind of take them out. It's one of those things, if you do in advance, that are better than in advance, I should say.
Yeah.
One of the fun things in Ibiza that is become very popular, that is interesting, kind of modern version that can be quite spectacular, because I think it's an interesting combination of decadence and simplicity, which for me defines Ibiza, is now you get this kind of lobster with kind of fried potatoes and green peppers and fried eggs. And so basically you're just kind of cooking very fast, kind of the lobster, and then you fry up some potatoes, and then you make a couple of fried eggs, and it's all kind of served together on kind of a platter. It's quite special because you have lobster, but it's with some fried potatoes and fried eggs, which makes it seem, is an interesting kind of combination. And it's really good, and it's fun. Those are two kind of fun summary things. I'm a big fan of the meatballs. And one of the meatballs that I was talking about, sobrasada, you can sneak some sobrasada into your normal meatballs and give them a really interesting kind of savoriness. And the typical meatballs, there's different ones. They do sauces in Menorca. It's a real sweet tomato kind of sauce, a real kind of thick one. And if you can get this over the salad, it makes a really interesting combination. Sprinkle some pine nuts on top. Again, perfect to make in advance.
I think meatballs would be more popular than sardines with my kids as well.
Yeah, and the meatballs, again, that's a great thing to get them kind of involved in, to help kind of roll them up. One of the most popular things, or the most famous thing, like you say, in Menorca is a stuffed eggplant, for instance. A lot of eggplant in the islands. And in Menorca, the stuffed version, so you're basically steaming it or you're boiling the eggplant. You're cutting it in half and you're emptying it out, and then you're kind of sauteing up some vegetables along with that inside part of the eggplant, and you kind of fill it, and then you put it back in the oven. Maybe some breadcrumbs on top. So it's a vegetarian dish. But in Mallorca, it's typical with some ground meat also. So it's the same first steps. And you make your sofrito with your onions and your tomatoes, but then you add some ground meat into it and some other things. And so you're stuffing the eggplant, then again, it goes back in the oven. And in Mallorca, it's also typical to kind of spread it with a tomato sauce. So again, here's a dish that is very, very popular. I mean, one of the most iconic dishes in the islands. Two very different versions. The classic Menorcan one, of which is just pure vegetables, and the typical Mallorcan one, which is a richer version with the meat and with the tomato sauce. Very doable at home. That's extremely popular. And let's not forget the tradition of sweets, because one of the things I find in these cuisines that tend to be at times kind of rustic, you have these elaborate traditions of sweets, endless cookies, endless versions of, pastries connected to every holiday. So for All Saints Day on November 1st, you have your marzipan cookies rolled in pine nuts. You have in Menorca, you have the typical one that's called a pastisset, which is kind of lard and flour and sugar, basically, kind of a petal-shaped cookie. In the summer, you get this cookie with pastisset made with egg yolks. And then you're going to have one with egg whites. Nothing is wasted with those. And I find that, as I said, I love the traditions that have a real practical base to them.
Well, I need to find that recipe for the egg whites, because I do a lot of desserts that have egg yolks. I do a lot of custards. I do a lot of creme brulees, and I always have a container of like 8 to 12 egg whites in my fridge. And I'm tired of doing like meringues and pavlovas. So that one sounds like I'm going to have to make that then.
Look up amargos, which is an almond cookie. And it's perfect because it's, ground almonds, sugar, some lemon zest, and egg whites.
I have everything.
They're magical. They're very, very easy. They disappear enormously fast. You have versions around in parts of Italy and in parts of Libya also. It's very typical. They're called amargos because they used to be made with bitter almonds or with some essence, but now no. It is very, very easy. And it's one of the classic favorites. It's something for me in the summer. You see them all year round. You see them really popular at Christmas time, like everybody has them at Christmas. But in the summer, when everybody's making pastissettes, because in the summer in the fiesta, you have this gin lemon kind of slushy drink that is. I mean, it's pomada is everything. Every house has it. You make this pomada. And with pomada, traditionally, you serve it with these pastissettes, these kind of floral shaped cookies.
Yeah. And that goes back to the using everything thing, right? If you're butchering hogs, you're going to have pork fat. Well, I've had such a great time talking to you today. And to all of our listeners, this has been Chris, as always, with Chefs Without Restaurants. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great week. You're still here? The podcast's over. If you are indeed still here, thanks for taking the time to listen to the show. I'd love to direct you to one place, and that's chefswithoutrestaurants.org. From there, you'll be able to join our email newsletter, get connected in our free Facebook group, and join our personal chef, catering, and food truck database so I can help get you more job leads. And you'll also find a link to our sponsor page where you'll find products and services I love. You pay nothing additional to use these links, but I may get a small commission, which helps keep the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast and organization running. You might even get a discount for using some of these links. As always, you can reach out to me on Instagram at Chefs Without Restaurants or send me an email at chefswithoutrestaurants@gmail.com. Thanks so much.